The Kansas sun in July doesn't shine, it punishes. I was there in the summer of 1888 north of Dodge City, when a man with no name rode out of the heat haze wearing a heavy wool poncho in 100-degree Kansas heat. That choice alone told me everything I needed to know about him. Men who dress like that in Kansas heat are usually hiding scars, sins, or a gun, sometimes all three. He was 43 years old, though his eyes looked 20 years older. And before that Tuesday was over, he'd spend his last $20 buying a terrified woman from 3 killers beside a dying ranch fence. That was the day Elias Thorne rode into the last good thing he'd ever do. I've lived through 88 summers now, but I still remember the heat of 1888 like it was yesterday, etched into my mind like a brand on a yearling. That was the year the law in Kansas was written in lead, and mercy was a currency most folks couldn't afford to spend, even if they had a pocket full of con. In those days, Dodge City was a place where a man could get rich on cattle or get buried for a cross look. Elias Thorne, though he hadn't used that name in a decade, sat atop a buckskin horse that was as lean and rugged as the Flint Hills themselves. He wore a heavy wool poncho, a strange choice for the heat, but it served 2 purposes. It kept the sun off his skin, and it hid the Colt 44 that sat low on his right hip, its walnut grip worn smooth by years of use. Elias wasn't looking for a fight, and he certainly wasn't looking for a woman to save, for he had long ago given up on the idea of salvation for himself. He was just looking for the next watering hole and a place to forget the things he'd done in the name of a badge he no longer wore, a piece of tin he'd tossed into a creek long ago. But the prairie has a way of pulling secrets out of the dirt, and Elias was about to find one that would break what little was left of his hardened, calloused heart. He heard the sound before he saw the trouble, the rhythmic, desperate thud of boots hitting soft earth, and the sharp, jagged cry of a woman who had run out of breath and hope at the same time. Elias pulled his horse to a halt behind a cluster of scrub oaks, his hand instinctively ghosting toward the hidden grip of his revolver as his heart rate settled into a steady, predatory rhythm. Through the shimmering heat, he saw a split-rail fence marking the edge of a forgotten ranch. There's a place where the wood was silvered by age and the land was reclaimed by weeds. 3 men, dressed in the dust-caked rags of hired killers, were dragging a young woman toward that fence, their laughter sounding like the dry rattle of a diamondback. She was 26, though the terror on her face made her look like a child lost in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her dress, once white and fine, was torn at the shoulder and stained with the red Kansas clay that seemed to want to pull her down into the earth. She wasn't just struggling, she was fighting with the feral energy of a creature that knows the cage is closing and the darkness is coming for her. Elias watched as the tallest of the 3, a man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his jaw like a map of a violent life, shoved her against the wooden rails. "You've run far enough, Clara," the man growled, his voice like grinding stones in a dry well. Clara Vance, a widow who had spent the last 3 weeks escaping the horrors of a border town brothel run by devils, didn't scream this time. She had no breath left for it. Instead, she bit the man's hand, drawing blood and a string of foul curses that stained the afternoon air worse than the heat ever could. Elias felt a coldness settle in his chest, a familiar sensation that usually preceded a funeral or a gunfight. And in the West, they were often the same thing. Now, listen close, because the West I knew wasn't like the dime novels you see in the city shops with their clean-shaven heroes and polished boots. It was a place where a man's character was tested in the seconds between a breath and a heartbeat, where dignity was often paid for in blood.
If you still believe old stories about courage, sacrifice, and men trying to do one decent thing before the trail runs out, then saddle up and ride with us.
Now let me tell you what happened that day outside Dodge. Elias didn't hesitate. He nudged the buckskin forward, the horse's hooves silent in the thick, velvet dust that carpeted the trail. He stopped 10 feet from the fence. The 3 men froze, their hands hovering near their belt, their eyes darting to the stranger who had appeared like a ghost out of the haze. The one with the scar, a local bushwhacker named Silas Marston, narrowed his eyes at the stranger in the poncho, trying to read the man beneath the wool. "Keep riding, drifter," Silas warned, his thumb hooking into his gun belt in a gesture of false bravado. "This is private business between gentlemen." Elias didn't move a muscle. his face a mask of weathered granite that had seen too many storms to be bothered by a little thunder. "Looks like a lot of noise for a hot afternoon," Elias said, his voice low and raspy, carrying the weight of 1,000 miles of trail. The woman, Clara, looked at him then, and Elias saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time, a flicker of hope so fragile it hurt to look at, like hope that had almost run out. "She belongs to the Gilded Lily back in town," Silas spat, referring to the infamous brothel run by the Marston gang where many a good soul had been lost. "And she's going back, one way or another, even if we have to carry her in a sack." Elias looked at Clara, seeing the bruises on her wrists and the fire in her eyes that refused to go out despite the odds. He knew he could kill them all before they cleared leather, but he also knew that blood in the dirt would bring the whole Marston clan down on this woman's head before the sun set. He reached into the pocket of his vest, his movement slow and deliberate so as not to spook the nervous men, and pulled out a single crumpled $20 gold piece. It was the last of his money, the sum of his worldly worth, meant for a new saddle and a week's worth of whiskey to drown the memories. He tossed the coin into the dirt at Silas's feet, where it sat gleaming like a fallen star in the dust. $20, Elias said, the words falling like lead weights into the silence of the prairie. "I'm buying her." The men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that rattled the dry leaves of the oaks and sent a hawk spiraling into the blue. $20 for a prime girl like this, Silas mocked. But his eyes were greedy as they fixed on the gold in the dust, for gold was the only god he truly worshipped. But Silas kept staring at the stranger's eyes beneath the poncho, and something about that cold stare made his stomach tighten. He figured the drifter wouldn't survive the night anyway. Might as well take the gold now and collect the girl later. He looked at Elias, measuring the man, seeing the way he sat in the saddle with the balance of a seasoned soldier, the way his eyes never blinked despite the glare. Silas was a coward at heart, and he recognized a predator when he saw one, even one hidden under a dusty poncho. He figured he'd take the gold, let the stranger take the girl, and then follow them until dark to take her back for free when the drifter was asleep. "She's yours, drifter," Silas said, scooping the coin from the dirt with a nimble, greasy hand. "But don't expect a refund when she tries to slit your throat in the middle of the night." They backed away, mounting their horses and riding off toward Dodge with a trail of dust following them like a lie. Elias dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry grass, and walked toward the fence where the woman stood shivering despite the 100-degree heat. Claire was slumped against the rails, her breathing ragged, her eyes fixed on the man who had just bought her life for a handful of gold. She didn't thank him, for she had learned that men rarely did anything for free in this part of the world. She didn't move. She just watched him with a suspicion that had been earned through months of betrayal and the harsh lessons of the frontier. "I don't belong to you," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "Nobody belongs to anyone out here," Elias replied, reaching out a hand to help her up, his voice unexpectedly gentle. She flinched at his touch, a reflexive movement born of pain, but eventually took his hand, her fingers cold as river stone despite the blistering heat. He led her to his horse, helped her into the saddle, and began to walk, leading the buckskin toward the north, where the horizon promised nothing but more dust. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the sounds of the prairie. They traveled for hours as the sun began its slow, majestic descent toward the horizon. Elias found a small spring tucked away in a limestone hollow, a rare mercy in the high plains where the water still ran clear and cool. He built a small fire, more for the comfort of light than for warmth, and shared his meager rations of dried beef and hardtack that tasted like salt and sweat. Twice during the night, Elias stopped talking and reached for his Colt when distant riders echoed somewhere across the prairie. Neither of them slept easy after that. Clara sat across from him, the oversized poncho he had given her draped over her shoulders, making her look small and fragile against the vastness of the night. She looked at the fire, the light dancing in her dark eyes, reflecting a sorrow that went deeper than any wound a knife could make. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally, her voice steady for the first time since he had met her. $20 is a lot of money for a stranger you don't even know the name of. Elias poked the fire with a stick, watching the sparks disappear into the dark. I once had a daughter, he said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat, cutting him as they came out. She would have been about your age, with the same stubborn look in her eyes when she was crossed. What happened to her? Clara asked softly, sensing the ghost that walked beside him. The world happened to her, Elias replied, and he didn't say anything more, for some pains are too large for words to carry. Clara looked at him, seeing the scars on his hands and the way he checked the shadows every few minutes with a practiced, lethal caution. She realized then that this man wasn't a hero from a storybook. He was a man who had lost everything and was just trying to balance the scales of justice before his time was up. Elias, she said, using the name she'd seen etched on the worn leather of his canteen. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away from his tired face. What you did today, it won't be enough, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Marston won't stop. He's a dog that doesn't let go of a bone once he's tasted the marrow. Elias narrowed his eyes, his hand moving toward the fire as if to warm a heart that had been cold for too long. Then what is he after, besides your life? Clara reached into the hidden hem of her dress and pulled out a small leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed and smelling of old ink and secrets. My husband was a federal marshal in Dodge, she explained, her voice trembling with the memory of him. My husband discovered Marston and 2 crooked judges were stealing land from widows across the territory. My husband was murdered for this book because it contains the names, the dates, and the codes of every bribe they ever paid. I'm the only one left who can read the codes inside and testify to what they did. Elias looked at the small book, then at the woman who had carried it through hell, realizing that her courage put his own to shame. He realized then that his $20 hadn't just bought a girl, it had bought a revolution, a chance to finally do one decent thing before the world buried him. The weight of the situation settled on him, a familiar burden of responsibility that he hadn't felt since he turned in his tin star years ago in a fit of rage and grief. You should have kept running toward the coast, Elias muttered, more to himself than to her, knowing the storm that was coming. I did, Clara replied, her jaw setting in a line of iron. But I'm tired of running, and I'm tired of being afraid of men who think they own the sun. Then she looked him dead in the eye and asked the question that broke what was left of his defenses. Elias, if they catch us, if Silas and his men get their hands on me again, I want you to promise me something. Elias waited, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest like a funeral drum. Promise me you'll use one of your bullets on me, she whispered, her voice trembling but her gaze unwavering. Don't let them take me back alive to that place. Don't let them use me to get to the truth. Promise me you'll be the one to end it, mercifully, before they can touch me again. The silence that followed was absolute, a hollow void that seemed to swallow the sounds of the night, the wind, the insects, even the crackle of the fire. Elias Thorne, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and committed his fair share of sins, felt a single tear track through the dust on his cheek. He looked at this brave and broken woman and saw the ghost of his own daughter, begging for a mercy he hadn't been able to provide when the world came for her. I won't let them take you, Clara, Elias said quietly. They'll have to kill me first. But the West is a place where promises are often buried under the weight of lead and the cruelty of bad luck. The next morning, the heat returned with a vengeance, the air shimmering with the promise of violence as they broke camp. Elias and Clara rode north, hoping to reach the federal garrison at Fort Riley, where the law still meant something more than a bribe. But Silas Marston was a man who knew the terrain like the back of his hand, and he had spent the night gathering his wolves. They were ambushed at the crossing of the Saline River, a place of red mud and steep banks where there was no room to maneuver. Bullets pecked at the dust like angry hornets, the sharp cracks echoing off the canyon walls and shattering the morning peace. Elias shoved Clara behind a large limestone boulder and drew his Colt, the weapon feeling light and familiar in his hand, an extension of his own righteous fury. He moved with a lethal, terrifying grace, a ghost in a poncho, returning fire with a precision that sent Silas's men scrambling for cover. One man went down with a hole in his chest, his life spilling out into the red mud of the riverbank. Another screamed as a bullet shattered his shoulder, his rifle falling into the water with a splash that sounded like a bell tolling. But there were more of them coming. 7 riders cresting the ridge behind Black Jack Marston himself. Jack was a man who enjoyed the sound of a dying man's breath. A sociopath with a silver-plated Remington and a heart of cold ash and greed. Elias looked at Clara, seeing her clutching the ledger to her chest, her face pale but determined, her eyes reflecting the sky. He looked at the riders spreading across the ridge and then at the revolver in his hand. He remembered her request, the plea for the final mercy, and he remembered his daughter's face in the moment she was lost to him. He felt the world narrowing down to a single desperate choice, a moment where a man defines who he truly is. But Elias Thorne wasn't ready to give up on the living just yet, not while there was still lead in his belt and blood in his veins. "Clara, listen to me and listen well," Elias shouted over the roar of the gunfight and the whistling of lead. "Take the horse, ride north, and don't look back, not even for a second. Don't stop until you see the blue coats of the cavalry. Don't stop until the ledger's in their hands." "What about you?" she cried, her eyes wide with terror and a sudden sharp grief for the man she barely knew. "I'm going to finish the purchase I started yesterday," Elias said with a grim final smile that held no fear. He slapped the buckskin's flank with all his might, sending the horse and Clara bolting into the tall grass and away from the river. As Clara disappeared into the grass, Elias heard 2 rifle shots crack into the sky far in the distance. Signal shots. Smart girl. Then he stepped out into the middle of the trail. He stood alone against 7 armed men, wounded, exhausted, and buying time with whatever life he had left. Black Jack Marston pulled his horse to a halt, a cruel, jagged grin spreading across his face as he looked down at the lone man. "You're a fool, old man," Jack shouted, his voice echoing with the arrogance of a man who thinks he's already won. "You're gonna die for $20 and a woman who won't even remember your name." "No," Elias replied, his voice steady as bedrock. "I died a long time ago in a town I've forgotten. Today, I'm just settling the debt I owe to the world." The canyon exploded in gunfire. Elias Thorne moved like lightning, his Colt a blur of motion as his first shots dropped 2 riders fast enough to throw the others into confusion. A bullet tore through his shoulder, nearly spinning him into the dirt. But he kept firing from one knee behind the rocks. He kept firing because Clara still had a chance to escape. He managed to drive the Marston gang back into the rocks, buying Clara the precious minutes she needed to vanish into the horizon. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the trail was silent once more. The only sound the groans of the wounded and the distant call of a vulture circling overhead. Elias Thorne lay slumped against a gnarled cedar tree, his poncho soaked in blood the color of the Kansas clay, his revolver empty and hot. Black Jack Marston walked up to him, his silver Remington pointed at Elias's head, his face contorted with rage at the loss of his men. "Where is she? Where's the girl in the book?" Jack hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Elias looked up, a bloody smile on his face, his eyes clear and bright with a peace he hadn't known in decades. "She's home," he whispered, "and you're out of time." And for just a second, Elias thought he saw his daughter smiling somewhere beyond the dust and sunlight. Jack Marston pulled the trigger, but the sound of the shot was drowned out by the thunder of 100 hooves and the blare of a bugle. The Federal cavalry swept into the canyon behind Clara Vance, who had ridden half the night to reach Fort Riley alive. Justice had arrived in Kansas, but like all things worth having, it had come at a heavy, staggering price. Clara Vance survived, and the ledger she carried brought down the Marston Empire and the corrupt judges who had fed upon the weak. She spent the rest of her long life building a home for the widows and orphans of the frontier, a sanctuary for those the world had forgotten. Most folks around Kansas simply called it Mercy House, but the older people who remembered the summer of 1888 knew exactly who it was built for. And every year, on a hot Tuesday in July, when the sun punished the earth, she would ride out to a small limestone hollow by a hidden spring, She would leave a $20 gold piece on a simple stone marker with no name, just a date and a promise kept, because she knew that the man who bought her life had given her something much more valuable than gold or land. He had given her the chance to stop running and the dignity to stand tall in a world of shadows. The West is a hard place, my friends, and time has a cruel way of erasing the names of the brave and the selfless. But as long as there is dust on the trail and a sunset over the prairie, the story of the Nameless Gunslinger will live on in the hearts of those who remember. It's a reminder that even in a world governed by lead and fire, one man's choice can still change the heart of the frontier. I'm an old man now, and my eyes don't see as clear as they used to, but I see Elias Thorne every time I close them and hear the wind. He taught me that you're never too old to do the right thing, and you're never too lost to find your way home. Even if home is just a memory, if these old stories still mean something to you, I'd be honored to see you riding with us again.
Tell me in the comments, what's the most selfless thing you've ever seen a stranger do in your own life?
Until next time, keep your powder dry, your aim true, and your heart steady against the storm. Safe travels, partner. Until we meet again on the trail.